At this story, and we cross now to Pretoria, where we're joined by Akinola Olojo, who's from the Institute of Security Studies, who knows this region quite well as a senior researcher there. Thank you very much for joining us on the line. We've been looking at this story for the last 24 hours, and I just wonder now, as we start to digest some of what it means, what does it mean for security in the east of the continent?
First, thank you for having me. It means a lot of things. The first thing is that I'd like to acknowledge the fact that compared to what happened in 2013, when the attack on the Westgate Mall shopping mall happened, this time around there was an improvement in terms of how security personnel arrived at the scene, and first responders also reacted in a way that was quite an improvement compared to the past. Now, there is a need now to begin to review the intelligence architecture. While, of course, Kenya already has its own national strategy on countering violent extremism, there is a need to begin to, reflect on those components of the strategy that touch on intelligence, and not just intelligence gathering, but also how intelligence is used, the timely manner in which it's used, because we're already hearing reports of being published of how, for instance, the intelligence agencies perhaps received some hints on what might have happened. And while, of course, that isn't clear, there's a lot of debate about that. But then it's important that there is a review of the intelligence, architecture. Now, another thing which, we all need to look at, in the wake of what happened yesterday, is the fact that there must be, education on how information and images are used and shared, especially online. If you take, for instance, when the events were happening yesterday and the attack was still ongoing, we had individuals and even some media agencies already sharing information. And of course, while that is good, it had its its merits in regard to letting people know who is where and how they can help. But then we should bear in mind that some of these terror groups and even affiliates, those linked to them, may also be keeping an eye on this. They have an online presence as well. We shouldn't rule that out. So there must be some education of for the public, the citizenry, on how this can be used in a good way. Another thing which I think is also important is the fact that the ever-present problem of addressing socioeconomic deprivation, in communities that are vulnerable, is very important. We all know that, of course, terror groups like Al-Shabaab always target youth and individuals in communities who are vulnerable, and of course they find them as easy prey. So of course the government and of course even the private sector, the whole of society approach needs to focus on how these issues can be addressed. And I think a final thing which emerges from what happened yesterday is the fact that there must be trauma counseling. In light of what happened yesterday and even past events, victims of the attack, those who survived, their families, they all need to have trauma counseling. And even those other categories of the population, even children, perhaps who heard and saw images, also might need counseling in regard to this.
All right. Going back to an earlier point, you talked about the review of the intelligence services operations. Is it possible that they've been actually thwarting some of Al-Shabaab's attacks and we just haven't heard about it?
Indeed, absolutely. I do believe that the security agencies, the intelligence architecture has actually been effective to some extent in terms of, preventing a lot of attacks. We may not, receive, information about this, as members of the public, but I do believe that they have been active in terms of preventing attacks. Al-Shabaab has been, attacking other parts of Kenya. Most times we talk about things when it happens in Nairobi, for instance, the Westgate incident, and of course in 2015, Garissa. But in between, we also had in Peketoni in 2014. And of course, when you look at the border between Kenya and Somalia, and you look at places like Lamu, like Mombasa, like Kwale, you realize that a lot is happening there. And sometimes the media carries this, And I do think that, the agencies in charge of, handling these issues have also been making a lot of efforts.
All right, Mr. Olojo, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed for your insights on this day. All right, so